Thank you to the organizers of this day-long deliberation on an exceedingly important theme. I'm of course grateful for being considered as a chair, but I must, in all honesty, put on record once again the fact that I'm not an Islamophobia studies person. I'm not somebody who has written on Islamophobia or has read much. But yes, because of a certain identity and because of my location in the Indian academia, I have no other option but to, or maybe I've had no other option but to be, in some senses, interested in Islamophobia as a global phenomenon and also as something that has unfolded in very peculiar ways in the subcontinent. So let me just quickly share my thoughts very briefly in relation to the presentations. I must congratulate the presenters because I genuinely believe that the themes are of interest. They merit our attention in true sense of the term. But I just have a few things to underline as a way of friendly suggestion and not really chair remarks. The first thing that I genuinely believe, and I say this as a student learner, as someone who believes in collaborative learning and unlearning, is that presentations need to be done, and this is just a suggestion, that they need to be done with a certain sense of exchange, right? So one of the things that we repeatedly go back to, specifically in the context of classrooms, and I suppose that argument can be extended in relation to seminar halls as well, is that the presenters need to sort of engage with the audience. Now, of course, few people take it too far. They don't present, they only engage. I'm not really endorsing that, the other end of the spectrum, but what I genuinely want to make a case for is that there has to be some sort of engagement, for the lack of a better word. And what exactly do I mean by that? I simply, perhaps, I'm implying that, just not reading and also looking at the poor audience, as it were. Because we are, one of the things that we must also acknowledge is that we live in a very different world. We live in a society, in a situation wherein attention is a rarity. And within seconds, you can actually miss your audience. So if no matter how eloquent, no matter how pertinent the theme is, the fact of the matter is that the audience will not be with me. Again, not necessarily for no fault of mine, but this is the situation in which we find ourselves as presenters and as audience. So that's just a friendly suggestion that, what we could perhaps do is have pointers, something that we do in classrooms as well, as opposed to having an entire 5,000-word lecture printed. We just have pointers. And we work with those pointers. So, of course, we borrow from the text. We go back to the text, but we also engage with the audience. So we can work with a few pointers. Let's say we have 8, 9 pointers, and pointers of the sort that we can elaborate on and, as it were, demand a certain involvement, attention from the audience. Now, in relation to the papers, I think the first paper by Salman al-Faris, it's an interesting take. I just want to, in addition to several important arguments made by the presenter, I just want to kind of add and point out that particularly in the context of the subcontinent, when we are looking at some sort of a coming together of British Orientalism and a certain kind of Hindutva, one-dimensional reading of the nation, communities, geographies, culture, etc. I think the meeting point is what we in sociology refer to as Indology, because this is where we see a very interesting connection between textual studies and the need for some sort of colonial administrative efficiency. So in the 19th century, in fact, towards the end of the 18th century, the colonial powers who had just kind of figured out what a treasure they embarked upon, they were trying to figure out how to efficiently administer the native population. So knowledge became a means of control. So what we get to read in the writings of Bernard Cohn and Talal Asad and Foucault is something that actually is to be found in the very early years of Asiatic society, right, late 18th century. So you're trying to know the people not because you are genuinely curious about the people. You're trying to know the people because you want to control them. You want to administer the population as effectively as you can. And it is here that textual sources became very important. When I say textual, I mean particularly Hindu scriptures in the context of Indology, of the sort that Max Muller and others advocated. So what exactly do textual references? There's nothing wrong with texts as such. Of course, we, particularly in academia, we have no other option but to seek recourse to texts incessantly, off and on, and so on, depending on the themes we are interested in. But in the context of Indology, of a certain kind of a subset of Orientalism, what was happening was that there was a certain determinism that textual studies brought to the fore. So it was more of defining the subject. So you simply define what is caste, you simply define what is village, you simply define what is a Muslim, and so on and so forth. And once you define, then of course others have no other option but to seek recourse to that grammar. And this is where control, power, and domination begin, right? So you define, and so end of the day, and again, you know, people like Foucault and others, and in a very different context, but perhaps more forcefully, people like Talal Asad have looked into this politics of definition, that we have no other option but to work with a certain definition of the secular subject, and which is why religion gets defined a certain way, right? So that is one, that Indology perhaps helps us understand, see these connections between British colonial Orientalism and a certain kind of Hindutva, straightforward, one-dimensional, black and white reading of groups. The other thing that I also quickly wanted to point out was that, you know, when we are reading about, and this is quite I think something that perhaps was not spelled out in the presentation, maybe it's there in the write-up, is that there's been a shift in terms of the way in which Tipu Sultan as an icon has been consumed. So I remember my growing up years, 1990s, early 90s, this was ages ago, you know, a TV serial, so the weekly serialized narration of Tipu Sultan, the icon. And this was happening at the same time when you have the Ramayana, which is something that people like Arvind Rajgopal and others have written about, that how it completely changed the politics of the subcontinent, Ramayana, the serialization of a Hindu epic. But Tipu Sultan was actually loved. The serial was loved by people across sections. And I distinctly remember the episode when Tipu fell, when he was killed by the British. You know, people, again, across religious identities, people genuinely felt that sense of loss. It was almost like a tragedy that they were a witness to. Now, this is 1990s, early 90s. And then suddenly, 15 years fast forward, and you see all kinds of crazy counter arguments in relation to Tipu Sultan through a very secular kind of an Islamophobia, a secular, shall we say, a secular concern. So, some sort of a euphemism. The fact of the matter is, it is an informed hatred towards Islam and Muslims, but it pitches across as well-meaning. It is secular, it's well-meaning. It is centered on the idea of empathy and perhaps operates from a vantage point of neutrality, wherein people were talking about violence and bloodshed and, you know, some sort of a, broadly speaking, human rights grammar. And this is within 15 years, it happens. And it's quite a paradigm shift in every sense of the phrase. So I was thinking about this whole shift that took place and how this very secular kind of an Islamophobia enters into a well-meaning Islamophobia that enters into the picture. And someone who's written quite remarkably, although I mean, of course, trained in the university, but at the moment working as a very good journalist, a good friend, Vikhar Ahmed Saeed, who writes for Frontline regularly. And Vikhar actually, I think it was about 3 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, wrote a very long essay in the Frontline in relation to the shifts vis-a-vis the icon, Tipu Sultan. So perhaps that is a piece that we can go back to, and that can help us add a few pointers to our already excellent work. In relation to Hannah's paper, once again, it is an interesting theme, and I suppose it merits our attention. But I was just thinking about, once again, this idea that the moment we get into too many, when we get into a proper academic discourse, so for instance, this whole idea of Orientalism, it can be, again, in my opinion, it can be a bit distancing, right? So what is it that as presenters we can do when we are looking into something that is markedly academic and very high-end stuff, right? Orientalism is no joke. Orientalism as a work and Orientalism as a corpus is something that haunts the imagination of sensible academia across the world. And it has been sort of, people have tried to bring in more nuances to the otherwise stellar work by Edward Said. And in that regard, I was just thinking that maybe we can bring in someone who's perhaps more accessible, someone like Dabashi, right? Who is not as, I don't know if I can say this, but who's not really as consequential, because, you know, Said essentially brings in a paradigm, and Dabashi as, of course, very much a Saidian, not really formally speaking, but someone who was a colleague, who was a colleague of Said, and of course now Said is no more. But Dabashi kind of brings in more lucid arguments to kind of restate the problem of Orientalism. And it is in this regard that one can always go back to more contemporary, once again, critiques of well-meaning Islamophobia, right? So Dabashi's not necessarily exchange, but his criticism of Dawkins and his exchange with the otherwise legendary philosopher Slavoj Žižek, right? So this whole idea of European, non-European thinking, reading, etc. And if we want to get into the academic discourse, solid academic stuff, then once again, somebody who is considered as quite an eminent Islamic studies, Sharia, established academic, Wael Hallaq, whose work Restating Orientalism is actually a very meaningful extension of Said's Orientalism. So I was just thinking about some of these, and from within the Islamic studies, mainstream Islamic studies, Mustafa Al-Azmi, because you were referring to the debates in relation to Revelation and Isnad and the rest, Mustafa Al-Azmi is the late Professor Mustafa Al-Azmi's extraordinary work, a history of the Quranic text, which is essentially an academic commentary on how the Quran became what it became. It is a rejoinder to, once again, this well-meaning critique of Quran as a revealed text. And Mustafa Al-Azmi, in a very academic way, kind of offers this incredible rebuttal. So I just wanted to point these pointers, these few things that I had in mind. But otherwise, I think both of you must be congratulated for the extraordinary work that you've done. I'll take maybe another 10 to 15 minutes and then wrap it up, because we don't have much time. Let me just quickly look into some of the things that I was thinking about in relation to a setting of this sort. If we are looking at Islamophobia, and particularly Islamophobia in the times we live in, what are some of the key pointers with which we can perhaps begin? In the sessions to come, you will be listening to folks who are way more into the studies and who have tangentially worked on this. And of course, the valedictory is by an academic I most sincerely admire, Professor Salman Said. Unfortunately, I will have to deprive myself of being his audience this evening because of some other occupation. because of some other engagement. So, but let me just quickly put on record a few pointers with which we can perhaps begin, in my opinion. The first thing is that we have to acknowledge that the term Islamophobia suggests a certain kind of newness of inquiry. In other words, what I'm trying to point out is that perhaps what scholars figured out is that otherwise important references such as racism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and so on are not really doing justice to this new phenomenon that is very much around. So this idea that perhaps racism does not encapsulate everything, that there is a specific way in which a certain hatred needs to be theorized. And for that, you have a word that is Islamophobia. So, and this is something that Salman Saeed only has written. I most sincerely recommend this particular paper of his that was published in 2014 in this journal called Islamophobia Studies that gets published, I think, at UC Berkeley. So in that particular piece, Salman Saeed talks about this idea that we need to understand Islamophobia as something that caters to a requirement that is altogether novel. So we start with this idea that racism will not do. And to think of Islamophobia, as many scholars have pointed out, that not scholars, many people, I don't think they really deserve to be called scholars because they just miss out on this very important nuance. As many people have pointed out, that why do we have to have this term called Islamophobia? Why can't xenophobia simply take care of it? Or why can't racism take care of it? Or why can't anti-Semitism take care of it? The point being that Jews and Muslims, end of the day, are Semites, and so on. But we need to start on this. There is no other way, in my opinion. Again, I stand corrected, and please correct me if I'm mistaken on this, about this. But we need to start on this note, that this is about coming up with a certain term that refers to a completely new social reality. So the term has been around for a while, but it is only in the 90s that the Runnymede report, the British Race Relations NGO, started talking about it. And there was an entire report on Islamophobia that came out in 1997. But before 1997, I think the most important event that leads to this idea of the Muslim subject as globally recognized is the anti-Salman Rushdie protests that emerge in response to the satanic verses. And this is where the Muslim subject is globally thought about. And then you have all kinds of interventions that are made. And you have well-meaning Islamophobia, and you have not so well-meaning Islamophobia, and so on. The other thing that we also need to understand in relation to Islamophobia is that it is not something that is inherited. It is something that is acquired, which essentially means that it is an informed position. So, in my opinion, that's my position, that there is no possibility of benefit of doubt when we are talking about Islamophobia. This is not some innocuous, innocent, ignorant person. This is something that is acquired. It's actually a position. Now, this position could be well-meaning. This position could be from the vantage point of secular liberal politics or some sort of a very wild democratic imagination. But the fact of the matter is that it is acquired. And therefore, again, in my opinion, no benefit of doubt for those who are, in marked sense, Islamophobes. The associated with this is the idea, the centrality of consistency. So Islamophobia is also something that is to be understood from the vantage point of consistency. So those who are Islamophobes remain very consistent in a certain kind of critical reading of Islam and Muslims, or Islamic worldview and Muslim societies and Muslim cultures. And of course, so these are things with which we can perhaps begin. That, this is not something that is inherited, so we can't really offer this benefit of doubt. This is a position. And there is an element of consistency, and it can operate from the vantage point of neutrality, or even empathy. Now, this is where I would like to draw your attention to a very recent piece written by Ashraf. I'm not able to remember the surname, my apologies. But this is 2022, again, Islamophobia Studies, wherein the author, and this is particularly instructive in relation to talking about Islamophobia in India. And Ashraf draws our attention to a very interesting distinction between what he calls pro-actionary Islamophobia and precautionary Islamophobia. This is, I think, as fine as it can be. It's fantastic. I think this is exceedingly perceptive. So there is what he calls pro-actionary. Now, this pro-actionary Islamophobia, he traces it back to Indian nationalism. And there are thinkers, there are historians, scholars like Faisal Devji, Amir Mufti and others who have written about this idea of the Indian Muslim as the last reference. So basically Indian Muslim as the yet to be conquered territory in relation to the project of Indian nationalism. That Indian nationalism will not really see the light of the day unless and until the Indian Muslim as a political subject is kind of brought into its folds. And there seems to be a certain tension between the Indian Muslim, to go back to Gyan Pandey's extraordinary, again, a brilliant article, Can a Muslim be an Indian? Right? It was, I think, more than 3 decades ago, but extraordinary stuff where Pandey also makes this argument that these hyphenated nationalities and the kind of tension that we have between these hyphenated nationalities, whether it is Afro-Americans or Indian Muslims or Hispanics, and the idea of a core nation, right? And how for a Muslim, it'll be very difficult, or it won't be that easy, shall I put it this way, it won't be that easy to be recognized as a nationalist, right? But anyways, to come back to Devji and Amir Mufti, who are essentially making this argument that Indian nationalism finds the Indian Muslim as some sort of an impediment. So it is in this regard that Ashraf, of course, he does not borrow from, if memory serves me right, he does not borrow from the likes of Mufti and Devji, but he is drawing our attention to this pro-actionary Islamophobia from the vantage point of Indian nationalism, right? So this is one. But the other one, which is actually way more subtle, and it's very difficult to, I wouldn't say it's very difficult, but it's not easy to kind of pinpoint this Islamophobia, is what he calls precautionary Islamophobia. This is some sort of an Islamophobia in anticipation, which is a very weird but tricky thing to think about. So, and this is where I think we are. I don't think the concern is as much to do with, because I think that discourse is already, I wouldn't say sorted, but I think enough attention has already been paid to what we call pro-actionary Islamophobia, the Islamophobia that remains very blatant in one sense or another. But when it comes to this precautionary Islamophobia, something that emerges from the point of neutrality. Now, neutrality, political correctness, these are the devils of the day. So for instance, we know it for a fact that in academia, you cannot be neutral. In journalism, you cannot be neutral. In any domain that claims any possible allegiance to scholarship or scholarly inquiry, neutrality is a curse. You need to do away with it, right? You can't be a student and neutral at the same time. You can't be a teacher and academic and be neutral at the same time. But precautionary Islamophobia actually comes across as well-meaning. So for instance, it comes from the vantage point of empathy, that you know what, we actually mean well for you, and therefore we are pointing this out. Now, precautionary Islamophobia could be understood. What are the examples? The examples could be, for instance, this whole, I wouldn't say debate, but this whole populist discourse vis-a-vis gender inequality. A certain concern vis-a-vis homophobia within the Islamic worldview, right? And this is, so how do you counter that? Because apparently this is well-meaning, right? We want Muslims to be we want the Muslim societies to be more gender equal. How can you possibly counter this? This is as valid a proposition as anything in the 21st century. But then turns out that there is a certain kind of precautionary Islamophobia. I'm reminded of, I wouldn't suggest you watch this video because this is complete waste of time. I have already wasted my 20 minutes, so I wouldn't suggest you do this. But Shekhar Gupta recently, in this series called Cut the Clutter, he ends up cluttering a lot more. But this series called Cut the Clutter, he ended up elaborating on the new violence, the communal violence that took place. I'm hoping that it is a past now, but that took place in a specific area of Haryana. And rather than talking about the violence, he ends up talking about fertility rate among Muslims. Absolutely not related at all. But data talks about the status of female education among the mayors of Mewat, which has got nothing to do with the communal violence, but apparently a very secular commentary. So in those 22 minutes, this veteran journalist ends up talking about everything except the violence. And this is all hardcore data that he's seeking recourse to, talking about all kinds of shady indicators in relation to specifically the mayors of Mewat, that how this particular, and ends up also saying things that I thought we were done with in the 90s, this whole idea of a Muslim fertility rate and a Hindu fertility rate. There are many demographers who've ripped it apart already, and people like Patricia and Robin Jeffrey have extensively, reflected on this, that you don't have something called Muslim fertility rate. It's a very problematic formulation of an otherwise important demographic indicator. So this is the precautionary. Now, a lot of people, again, not to waste your time, but if you go through the comments on this particular YouTube video that I posted, a lot of people might not be in the common sense Islamophobes. They might be people who are genuinely interested in communities developing, right? In women of any community gaining access to education. So they are well-meaning, but they are essentially falling a prey to this neutrality business, this both-sided journalism and whatnot. So that's, and lastly, not lastly, but I would say the second last argument. For a very long time, Islamophobia was looked at from the vantage point of some sort of irrational, ill-informed, or perhaps uninformed fear, right? Phobia. And this is something that we go back to. I think all the dictionaries lead us in the same direction, that phobia is to do with fear, and perhaps in most of the cases, it's a fear that is baseless. It doesn't have any logical explanation. But then, to kind of capture the nuances of, and to capture the subtext layers of Islamophobia in the times we live in, scholars have drawn our attention to the fact that merely using the word fear will not do. We need to bring in the idea of hatred. So now when we think about Islamophobia, we must take this leap from the idea of fear to the idea of hatred. Because if we continue with the idea of fear, there is once again a certain benefit of doubt that we offer to those who are hosts to Islamophobic sentiments. But the moment we go from fear to hatred, we essentially attribute a certain agency to these people. That there is a certain idea of willingness. There is an element of agency. There's an element of thought and investment in the sentiments that these people hold dear. So and I think this is an important move. It's an important shift. And lastly, and this is where I go to Professor Salman Sayyid. And I think it's a fantastic, there are two arguments that he makes. And he borrows one from David Theo Goldberg, and the other is, of course, his own argument. Now, Goldberg makes a very interesting distinction, and borrowing to a certain extent from Foucault, between what he calls racist states and racial states, or the distinction between a racist state and a racial state. Now, the racist state we are kind of aware of. And officially speaking, after the end of apartheid in South Africa, we are done with racist state. Again, officially speaking, many states indulge in racist policies all the time across Europe. But as far as the official narrative is concerned, after the apartheid regime in South Africa, we are apparently over with what we call racist state. So basically, racist state is a state that considers race as a principle in matters of governance and policy making. Long story short. But then, if we have to make sense of Islamophobia as a pervasive phenomenon across polities of the world, we need to go from racist state to what David calls racial states. And racial state is a state that kind of divides the population into racial categories. And then this division can actually be functional for some kind of a policy that categorically goes against a particular group and favors another group. So, borrowing from that, this whole distinction between racial and racist, Salman Sayyid considers Islamophobia as something that has to do with, and it's a brilliant combination of Foucault and Goldberg. He says racial governmentality. It's a brilliant phrasing. I don't think there can be anything more than this. Racial governmentality. So governmentality, those of us who've done political science, literature, sociology, even anthropology would know governmentality as an important reference, goes back to Michel Foucault's lectures on politics in the times we live in. And governmentality is, for Foucault, it's basically a new method. It's an art, and also in some sense the science of governing people. Governmentality is not just government. And Foucault looks at it in the broader context of surveillance, security, and the need for regulation. And Salman Sayyid brings the idea of racial state and the idea of governmentality together and talks about Islamophobia as what he calls racial governmentality. And the last point is, and again Salman Sayyid, because he's also in this particular paper, A Measure of Islamophobia, he's repeatedly trying to make this argument that why Islamophobia is supposed to be there, why we can't say that Islamophobia doesn't really bring in anything new. And he talks about other subjects. So for instance, if you're thinking about a homosexual, and then we talk about homophobia, and if you think about woman and talk about sexism, or if you think about a black person and talk about racism and so on, or Jew and anti-Semitism, what Salman Sayyid refers to is that when it comes to the idea of the Muslim, and it's a very important point, he says that what we are looking at, the Muslim subject, is not exactly akin to the homosexual, is not just a woman. The Muslim subject is a very different subject. And he talks about the Muslim subject as to do with the degree of willingness to remain the same. So for instance, when we, in the contemporary discourse, if you look at, I'm not taking a position at the moment, but in the contemporary discourse, if you look at sexuality studies, and particularly the defense of homosexuality, one of the things that is repeatedly talked about is that it isn't really something that can be corrected. Right? That's the argument. Right? If you are oriented sexually to the same sex, or if you are oriented at times here and at times there, it is not really something that can be corrected. So there is nothing that the person can do about this. But Salman Sayyid is pointing out that in the context of Islamophobia, the disposition is that Muslims can always do something about their Muslimness. And this is an important point, which is why Islamophobia is not to be understood as just another phobia. It is a specific kind of phobia, right? So Muslims can do something about their Muslimness, the degree of their Muslimness. They can do something about that. He also says that Islamophobia needs to be countered not simply in relation to fear and hatred, but as something that denies Muslims the agency to define themselves as Muslims. So Islamophobia brings in a certain hegemonic definitional universe, as a result of which Muslims are denied the possibility of defining their own Muslimness. Something that could be said in relation to anti-Semitism as well, something that anti-Semitism does to the idea of Jewishness, that the Jew, to begin with, will be deprived of this opportunity or this possibility of defining who he is or what does he or she consider as part of Jewishness. So these are some of the things that I thought can be, of course, these are very tentative, elementary, foundational remarks. But I genuinely believe that if we were to kind of start with some of these important markers, perhaps we will arrive at a more nuanced and a more relevant and a more significant understanding of Islamophobia. I should also end that, and I again borrow from Professor Sayyid because I think this is a very important point that he made, that there are people who see Islamophobia everywhere, right? And then there are people who see Islamophobia nowhere. And he says that the actual reading of Islamophobia is somewhere in between. So we should not become these, hyper-obsessed students of Islamophobia who theorize everything in relation to Islamophobia, right? But then there is hardly any difference between us and any staunch orthodox, I'm just using this term, Marxist or anyone, right? Because there is a world that is beyond the, Marxists wouldn't like it, but there's a world that is beyond historical materialism. So Sayyid points this out, that, Islamophobia, if you really want to get into it earnestly, then we should understand that it is somewhere between these two pointers. One, where we see everything from the vantage point of Islamophobia. It's a problem. It will not take us very far. And the other, we just don't see Islamophobia at all. It is, of course, a problem. And we have to find ourselves somewhere in between, which, according to Sayyid, is the road less traveled. Thank you for your attention.